My name is Deborah Thomas, and I am the Chief of the Serial and Government Publications Division here at the library. Thank you for joining us at this particular session, which is called Made at the Library, an event series highlighting works inspired by and emerging from research at the Library of Congress. It features authors, artists, and other creators in conversations with library experts. This series takes a deep dive into the process of working with the library collections. Today we're here for a conversation between Louisa Treger, author of the recently published book Madwoman, and Amber Paranik, reference librarian in the newspaper and current periodical reading room at the Library of Congress. Our guest this afternoon is author Louisa Treger. Louisa is a classical violinist and studied at the Royal College of Music and Guildhall School of Music in London, and worked as a freelance orchestral player and teacher. She subsequently turned to literature, earning a PhD in English at the University College London, where she focused on early 20th century women's writing, and was awarded the West Scholarship and the Rosa Morrison Scholarship for distinguished work in the study of English language and literature. She's the author of The Lodger in 2014, The Dragon Lady in 2019, and Madwoman, published this year in 2022. She's currently working on her fourth novel. The Madwoman was just included on the London Times and Sunday Times lists of best historical fiction books of 22 so far. Amber Paranik has been a reference librarian at the Library of Congress since 2008. Thank you again for joining us today. Amber?
Thank you, Deb. Many people know journalist Nellie Bly for her well-documented 72-day trip around the globe in 1890, inspired by the Jules Verne novel Around the World in 80 Days. But others may not know her significance as an investigative journalist, suffrage advocate, and inventor. As someone reading Bly's writings in the present day, one can still find strength in her voice and relevance to our times in relation to women's rights and advocacy. She was known for frequently going undercover, and in 1887, under the name Nellie Brown, she had herself committed to an asylum in New York for 10 days so she could expose the horrible conditions there. Her report on the asylum and later reports inspired change. She also helped pave the way for women in journalism. Her work inspired other girl stunt reporters, as they were then known. Through their work, they changed laws, helped launch a labor movement, championed women's rights, and redefined journalism for the modern age. I wanted to share a little bit of background about our reading room. As the name of the newspaper and current periodical reading room suggests, we hold the library's collection of U.S. and foreign newspapers, which are available in a variety of formats, including print, microform, and databases. We also provide access to the most recent 2 years of print format scholarly journals and popular magazines, in addition to periodicals and electronic databases. Our comic book collection is the largest publicly available collection in the world. We also have government documents and an open reference collection that focuses on journalism, politics, and government, and research related to periodicals, such as the periodical and newspaper indexes. We also provide an Ask a Librarian service and a daily live chat session to assist remote researchers. Louisa Treger first contacted the reading room in 2018 for information on Nellie Bly. She wrote, "I am a UK-based writer beginning to research a book on Nellie Bly. I am right at the beginning of my research, and I wondered what material you have. My focus is on Nellie Bly's early life, her childhood and career leading up to the time she spent in the lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island and subsequent expose." Louisa, how did you first hear about Nellie Bly, and what was it about Nellie that drew you to her?
Well, it all started with a question from a friend, a British friend. She said to me, "Have you heard of Nellie Bly? She's the kind of woman you write about." I hadn't heard of Nellie, but went away to research her and was instantly hooked. I knew I had my muse for my next book. And I think what got me, what really sort of grabbed my imagination, was wondering what kind of person could voluntarily get herself committed to a mental asylum, a notoriously brutal one, moreover, and especially in the late 1800s, when women were supposed to be submissive and well-behaved.
Thank you, Louisa. Well, in addition to the Library of Congress, did you look to other places for resources?
I did. I went to the New York Public Library. I must say that the Library of Congress remains my firm favorite. But I also went to Blackwell's Island, which is now Roosevelt Island, because I felt that I had to set foot on the island like Nellie before me to understand its story. And when I arrived, I took a few moments to get my bearings and speak to a few of the inhabitants. And a man in his wheelchair outside his convalescent home pointed me to the next door building as the site where Nellie spent 10 days. And I walked over and saw that all that's left of the asylum is its octagonal tower, which is now part of a gentrified block of apartments. But as I walked around the island, I couldn't help picking up this really sad and eerie atmosphere. I was walking the steps, literally, of where the inconvenient in American society was sent over 130 years ago. In Nellie's time, there was a prison, a workhouse, a smallpox hospital, and the asylum. So it was literally the Isle of the Undesirables, you know, where these people were sent, so they were out of mind, out of sight of ordinary, respectable New Yorkers. And as I stood there, I looked at Manhattan, and it was so close. And it must have been absolutely agonizing for the women of the asylum. It really brought that home to me, and it kind of made the setting just come to life in my head. Because although Manhattan is so close, that river is home to currents and patrol boats, which makes that gut-wrenchingly short journey inaccessible. And in fact, a few of the women did try to swim. They were that desperate. And they were dubbed river runners, and all of them lost their lives. So, I mean, it was incredible just being on the island, even though, you know, it's been gentrified. It's got shops and schools and people going, you know, getting on with their lives. But I could feel the history underneath it.
Thank you. Let's see. Well, Nellie Bly was first, she was born and raised in Pittsburgh, and she then moved to New York. Can you talk about how Nellie Bly moved to New York and how she approached Joseph Pulitzer of the World and the then managing editor, John A. Cockerell?
So before Nellie came to New York, she was working for the Pittsburgh Dispatch, but she was confined to writing about things like fashion, society gossip, and arts reviews, and she hated it. So she moved to New York, hoping that an editor would give her a chance to write the serious news stories she so badly wanted to. When she got to New York, it was a heat wave. It was the hottest summer on record. And she went from newspaper office to newspaper office. But not one editor would employ her because she was a woman. And at last, down to her last dime and desperate to prove her worth, she talked her way into the offices of Cockerell and Pulitzer. And I'm going to read you a passage from my book that shows how she did it, because I think it gives a good insight into Nellie's character. "Good day," she greeted the guard. "My name is Nellie Bly. I'm a reporter from the Pittsburgh Dispatch, and I've come to see Colonel Cockerell." I am sorry, miss. He's not seeing visitors today, he told her kindly. He had blue eyes under thick, sandy brows and crinkly, sandy hair. She tossed her head and set her jaw. I intend to see Colonel Cockrell, she said firmly. He shook his head. Even President Cleveland couldn't get in to see the Colonel today. That's his orders. I'm going to see him if I have to stay here the whole day. Beneath her skirts, her knees had started shaking. For Pete's sake, miss, surely it's not that urgent. Please, come back another time. Despite the heat and the churning fear and anger inside her, she managed to hold on to her composure. If you don't tell Colonel Cockrell that I've come to see him, I shall wait at this gate all day long and all night and all day tomorrow. The guard frowned and shook his head. A passing office boy stared at her with unconcealed curiosity. Minutes crawled by. The guard stood a few feet away from her, the baffled look on his face turning to exasperation and finally anger. Half an hour passed, then an hour. She was thirsty and she felt dizzy. There was pressure behind her eyes that threatened to bloom into a full-blown headache at any minute. It was dreadful to be threatened like this, even worse than the too familiar smiles and insolent stares. Flesh and blood could not stand it. She wanted to run away, but she would not leave without a job. What shall I do with her? The guard entreated a passing reporter. For God's sake, O'Connor, turn her out. She's disturbing the whole building. I've tried, sir. She won't listen to reason. Newspaper men were gathering, arguing about how to get rid of her. Fetch a policeman. She's likely barking mad. Oh, leave her alone. She'll get tired and give it up. What does she want with Cockrell? She says she was a reporter in Pittsburgh. But he hates impromptu callers, especially female ones. While they were busy debating, Nellie quietly opened the gate and made her way through the lobby. As she hurried up the stairs, she heard someone yell, "Stop right there, young lady." She did not turn around. A good-natured voice answered, "Oh, let her go. If she's that determined, well, hats off to her, I say." What will Cockrell? Let him deal with her. So I chose that passage because it shows Nellie's sheer determination, but also the human cost to her of acting in that way. And I kind of feel that I should be reading to you in an American accent. This book feels not quite right in an English one.
No, it sounds great. Thank you for sharing that piece with us. Well, subsequently, the world asked Nellie to take on an undercover assignment and to get herself committed to Blackwell's island. She was determined to complete the task, and in her book, 10 Days in a Madhouse, she wrote, "I said I could and I would, and I did." How did she get herself committed to the asylum?
Well, the strategy for getting committed was totally Nellie's invention. In the flickering gaslight of her room, she read horror stories and ghost stories and got herself so worked up that every sound in the corridor made her jump. She practiced a wide, unblinking stare in the mirror, and she wandered the streets in a daze because she decided that faraway expressions looked crazy. When she felt prepared, she booked a room at a cheap boarding house for women with just a handful of change in her pocket, and she proceeded to lose her mind. Her performance was so convincing that by bedtime, one woman said, "I'm afraid to stay with such a crazy being," and her friend added, "She'll murder us all before daybreak." In the morning, Nellie refused to leave, and the police were called. So the police, a judge, and doctors, interviewed or examined her, and they were unanimous in their opinion that she was totally demented. and Blackwell's Island was the only place to send her. And the whole thing between turning up at the women's boarding house and the boat to the island took 5 days.
Oh, that's right. And while she was in Blackwell's Island, can you speak about what she encountered and what was it like living among the other residents?
Of course. So conditions were appalling, and the patients were freezing cold, starving, and the nurses were sadistic and brutal. So it was really awful. And one of the things that really struck me was that Nellie soon discovered that many of the so-called mad women were not actually mad. They simply refused to conform to the narrow standards of society. For example, there were women who married without their parents' consent, or women who refused to marry at all, women who couldn't get over postpartum depression or witnessing some horrible tragedy, and women whose husbands simply got tired of them. So in short, the asylum was a socially acceptable way of dealing with inconvenient women. And then I started thinking about the recent past and people like Kathleen Kennedy, who was shut away and lobotomized. And then I thought about Britney Spears and her 13-year conservatorship. And, you know, it's just appalling that this is still going on. And it kind of brought home to me why I write historical fiction, which is that history is not a series of dry facts that happened years and years ago. It's this narrative that we relive and keep reliving in the present.
Exactly. Yes, thank you. Thank you. So, Louisa, you also use the library's vast collection of digitized newspaper pages called Chronicling America to learn more about George Madden, Erasmus Wilson, and Colonel John A. Cockrell. Madden and Wilson both worked for the Pittsburgh Dispatch as the managing editor and columnist, respectively. Colonel Cockrell was, as Louisa mentioned, the editor at The World. For those unfamiliar, the Chronicling America historic newspapers online collection is a product of the National Digital Newspaper Program and jointly sponsored by the Library and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And it currently contains more than 20 million newspaper pages from 1777 to 1963. How valuable were these primary sources in your research?
They were absolutely invaluable, and I don't think this book would exist without them. There's a vividness to primary material that you simply don't find in secondary sources, and the library's collection is so big and so rich, and I was able to read everything Nellie Bly wrote and everything that was written about her, and so, you know, that really brought a vivid picture of her to my mind and let me get into her thoughts. And I just want to take a minute here to thank Amber and her colleagues, but particularly Amber. So she, you know, I just turned up at the library and she didn't know me from a bar of soap, but she showed me with infinite patience and kindness and knowledge how to get around, you know, the collection, which is really big. I found it really confusing. And she taught me how to do things like read old newspapers, you know, on microfiche. And I must say, it didn't come easily to me, and I really struggled. And
Okay,
just
that's
thank you
okay.
for your patience.
You're so welcome.
Because I don't think the book would exist without you and the library.
Thank you. Thank you. My face is probably bright red, but thank you. It's been such a pleasure to work with you.
You really deserve all the accolades. So
Thank you, Louisa. Well, back to the book. So Pulitzer and Cockrell from The World claimed to get her out of the asylum, but do you think Nellie had any doubts that she would be released?
Well, she definitely had doubts because they said to her, "We don't know how or when we're going to get you out. Just play your part and get in, and we'll figure out the rest." But when she was in the asylum and days passed with no word from the world, questions started to fill her mind. Had she bitten off more than she could chew? Had the newspaper encountered some legal issue in trying to secure her release and simply washed its hands of her? But perhaps more importantly, in trying to convince the authorities that she was insane, would she lose her own mind? I think it must have been terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Why do you think Nellie was so motivated to help the disenfranchised and share their stories, and women in particular?
Well, I think that's a great question, and the answer lives in Nellie's early life. So she was born to privilege. Her dad was a judge, but he passed away suddenly when she was young, leaving no will, and it left his family in dire straits. Nellie's mother soon remarried, but the new husband was a violent drunk, and so Nellie's whole world was turned upside down. She had to learn to function and survive in other ways. And I think it was those years of privation that gave her a terrific sense of kinship with the marginalized. Those years made her what she was. And I think she wanted to help women because she'd watched her mother, struggle with destitution, really, when her dad died. And Nellie had seen that her mum almost had no choice but to remarry. And that marriage was a disaster, and it put the whole family in danger. So it made Nellie realize how woefully few options were available to women. And she wanted to change that, and she did change it. Because as well as the women she helped, she also paved the way for women in journalism. And Amber's, referred to the other stunt girls, but, they were the forerunners of full-scale investigative journalism. And, that's really important. And Nellie created the first real place for women as regular members of the newspaper staff and an important part of the editorial mix. So, I've sort of said that before her day, women were only allowed to write on very limited things like fashion and gossip and all that, but Nellie busted right out of that mold, and she paved the way for what successive generations of women journalists have achieved. So she was remarkable. She was so far outside her time, and she really changed the world and left it vastly improved.
Thank you. Absolutely. So in the wake of Nellie's blistering report, administrative changes were implemented at the lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island, and $1 million was earmarked for the revitalization. Nellie continued to work and write about poverty and politics with a special focus on women, whom at the time no one would speak about. In 1889, she set out to travel around the world, attempting to smash the record of Phileas Fogg, the protagonist of Jules Verne's novel Around the World in 80 Days. She made the trip in 72, beating Fogg by a week. The feat turned her into an international sensation. In 1914, she started working for the New York Evening Journal as America's first war correspondent, where she reported from the front lines of World War I. She returned stateside in 1919 and died of pneumonia at the age of 57. I'm going to wrap things up this afternoon by thanking you so much, Louisa, for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It truly was an honor and a pleasure. And, it's having turned up here 4 years ago as this very unsure researcher, is just lovely to come back and talk to you about, what resulted from that research.
Amazing. We love to see that too, to hear about researchers' stories and to see the final product. So it's so wonderful to have you here, and it's such a compelling and inspiring account. So thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.